Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Monday, March the 8th, 2021. My name is Pam. Our first article, Cuomo, Democrats, and the Politics of Personal Conduct by Linda Feldman. Washington. One day, one as President, Joe Biden, laid down a marker for anyone working in his White House. Treat one another with respect, or I will fire you on the spot. We have to restore the soul of this country, he added, a not so subtle dig at his predecessor. Indeed, less than a month later, a senior member of the Biden press team was asked to resign over his use of sexual, crude, threatening language towards a female reporter. But in a larger sense, the president's plea for civility and decency also seemed aimed at the nation, including the Democratic Party he leads. Now the politics of personal conduct has burst forth yet again. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, a prominent Democrat, is facing calls for resignation over alleged sexual harassment of women, two of whom worked for him at the time. The scandal has been compounded by another embroiling Governor Cuomo, allegations that his administration purposely withheld data on COVID-19 deaths in New York's nursing homes. Yet, some 3 years after the hashtag #MeToo movement swept the nation, bringing new scrutiny and standards to workplace behavior and power imbalances, the reports of Mr. Cuomo's sexually charged language with young women are raising knotty political and ethical questions for Democrats. Some see a moral imperative to draw a bright line on such matters, remembering the damage of the Clinton era. Others are wondering if the party has been at times too quick to react, such as in the case of former Minnesota Senator Al Franken. Indeed, after watching Republicans largely disregard sexual assault allegations against President Donald Trump for 4 years, some are asking, why should Democrats be so much harder on their own? We have no other choice if we're going to stay true to our principles, says Democrat strategist Jim Manley. I'd rather see us leave the hypocrisy to the Republicans. I have no problem with Joe Biden setting a high standard. GOP pollster Whit Ayers doesn't see the Biden message on respect as necessarily having a partisan bent. It's clear that President Biden ran the campaign with an underlying theme that character is as important as policy, Mr. Ayers said. That is not a Republican or a Democratic message. It's a message that has particular resonance throughout the ages. Republicans disagree that they look the other way at bad behavior in their ranks. Plenty of party members paused over Donald Trump's numerous alleged sexual misdeeds that came to light during his first campaign. But once he was elected president, the party effectively decided to live with his past. And while President Trump was accused of sexual misconduct while in office, as Mr. Cuomo has been, the former president's mercurial style led to many high-level departures during his time in the White House. Some former officials don't hide their disdain for the ex-president, though he remains popular with the party's base. Bad optics for the GOP have continued, with two freshman congressmen facing harsh allegations this week about past behavior. In a Pentagon report, Republican Ronnie Jackson of Texas was accused of sexual harassment and drinking alcohol on the job while serving as White House physician. Republican Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina also faces renewed allegations of past sexual misconduct. Both men have denied the charges, and it remains to be seen how their party caucus will handle the reports. Of course, Democrats have their own history of looking the other way at prominent members who engage in sexual misconduct, including former President Bill Clinton. Some feminists played down reports of Mr. Clinton's misbehavior when he was running for president and stuck by him even after his impeachment for lying under oath about sexual misdeeds, arguing that his policies were good for women. Today, Mr. Biden's own stance on bad behavior, if not sexual impropriety, at least the incivility he decried on Inaugural Day, hasn't come without inconsistencies. He nominated Neera Tanden, a veteran of the Clinton and Obama administrations, to be his budget director, despite a history of mean tweets against prominent senators of both parties. Her prospects collapsed last week after Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia announced he could not support her after concluding that her past statements would have a toxic and detrimental impact on her ability to work collaboratively with members of Congress. Still, when Ms. Tanden withdrew from consideration Tuesday, Mr. Biden said he looked forward to having her serve his administration in a position that doesn't require confirmation. Some political observers suggested that it is Ms. Tanden's fighting spirit that led Mr. Biden to want her on his team in the first place. And adhering to standards of civility, they add, doesn't mean his people will be patsies when confronting opposition to the Biden agenda. But Ms. Tanden's tweets were one thing. More problematic, legal experts say, is the episode of her pushing a journalist, which she acknowledges. Mr. Cuomo's alleged pattern of conduct with now former aides also suggests potential violation of law. There is a line, says Margaret Johnson, co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism at the University of Baltimore. The law says you can't, in an employment setting or other setting, treat someone with unwelcome sexual advances or comments that are severe or pervasive. That affects the terms and conditions of their employment. New York Attorney General Letitia James has now launched an independent investigation into the charges against Mr. Cuomo. Numerous Democratic officials have called on him to resign, both over the alleged sexual harassment and the nursing home imbroglio. But at his press conference Wednesday, Mr. Cuomo seemed to buy time. He apologized for his behavior towards his 3 female accusers, and he insisted he meant no harm, though he still seemed to put the onus on the women's perception of his behavior and not on the behavior itself. If they were offended by it, then it was wrong, Mr. Cuomo said. If they were offended by it, I apologize. Commentators suggested that the #MeToo movement has moved into a new phase, in part because Mr. Trump, seen by some as the catalyst, is no longer in office. With Donald Trump out of the limelight, by definition, the entire movement stepped back a bit, says Jennifer Lawless, a political scientist at the University of Virginia. We've seen so many egregious examples of sexual harassment and sexual assault and just hostile working conditions for women that, and this is a pretty terrible way to put it, the novelty has worn off, Professor Lawless says. In some ways, people have become almost innocuous against these kind of charges. And she adds, given the global pandemic and profound economic challenges some face, other issues fade in prominence. Ms. Lawless points to the resignation of Senator Franken in January 2018, early in the #MeToo movement, as an example of how accused public figures were given much less opportunity to defend themselves than they are now. The sexual assault convictions of former Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein were one thing. The murkier charges leveled against Mr. Franken, beginning with the resurfacing of an old photo from his comedy days of him pretending to grope a female comedian, were something else. Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, an advocate for women's rights who led the charge against Mr. Franken, has been more cautious over her home state governor's fate and not called on him to resign. The importance of a full investigation has become really key, says Ms. Lawless, noting that some investigations of accused men haven't panned out. Like with any movement, the pendulum swings back and forth until it hits the right point. The main thing, she says, is that women still need to feel they can come forward with accusations and bring bad conduct to the forefront without being maligned in the process. Letty Coaten Pogrebin, a founding editor of Ms. Magazine, hails from the era of second-wave feminism, when women gained reproductive rights and other laws aimed at equality, but still struggled with the power dynamic in the workplace and in social settings. Now she looks at her 20-something granddaughter's generation and sees that it's still hard to educate a male superior who has power over you. You're trying to be taken seriously, but you still get reduced to how you look, Ms. Pogrebin says. As for Mr. Biden's day one edict, She says, it's a proclamation that norms are returning. Be prepared. And now, are Myanmar's generals open to persuasion? Depends who's persuading. By Ann Scott Tyson. As Myanmar's pro-democracy protesters brave gunfire from security forces that killed scores of civilians last week alone, the international community is seeking ways to rein in the military junta that seized power last month. Potential leverage points to help steer the Southeast Asian country out of the current crisis stems from 10 years of political, economic, and social opening under a semi-civilian government that abruptly ended on February 1st. The decade of reform has begun to plug Myanmar and its 57 million people into Asia's dynamic economies after decades of impoverished isolation. But whether Myanmar's new connectedness can translate into greater pressure on its military rulers remains an open question, experts say. In fact, resource-rich Myanmar's regional integration may be working to prevent a tougher public stance towards the coup's leaders, and Asian countries want to keep channels open for diplomacy and persuasion. Regional powers in Southeast Asia, as well as China, Japan, and the United States, have widely differing levels of both influence and political will to persuade the military to return to the democratic path in Myanmar. Equally, if not more important, are the ways in which Myanmar's opening has created new connections between Myanmar's people, especially the protest movement and civil society, and the rest of the world. The last 10 years have seen Myanmar open up to the outside world, and that's created a boom both in incoming investment and trade, says Gregory Pauling, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It also created a boom in information technology. Everybody now has internet-connected 4G phones. Everybody's on Facebook, he says. It's certainly a different world in Myanmar than it was a decade ago, and the generals are finding that out the hard way as they try to clamp down on these protests and find that they are much more adaptive and resilient. A young generation that came of age enjoying new freedoms and connectivity is now joining the ranks of protesters in Thailand, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, using social media to trade ideals and build solidarity. A muted statement. The 10-Nation Association of Southeast Asia Nations, or the ASEAN, which promotes regional integration and diplomacy, has a major stake in ending the crisis in Myanmar, a member state. Yet hampered by internal divisions and institutional paralysis, the regional bloc could only muster a muted statement this week that calls for all parties in Myanmar to halt violence and begin dialogue. This is a huge headache for ASEAN, says a Southeast Asia expert who spoke on condition of anonymity due to security concerns. It's very difficult for ASEAN to be in the driver's seat of the regional agenda when one member is dragging it down. Moreover, ASEAN members oppose broad economic sanctions on Myanmar, arguing they would only hurt ordinary people and push the regime further towards China, Myanmar's largest trading partner and its second biggest investor after Singapore. Japan and Thailand are also major investors. Despite growing connectivity, ASEAN is between a rock and a hard place on Myanmar's, says Mr. Pauling. They worry that if it returns to full-on pariah status, it will become a weight around the neck of the organization, he says. The fear is that sanctions would back the generals into a corner and make them even more violent and less susceptible for international cajoling, he said. Instead, ASEAN now seeks to establish itself as a conduit for outside parties to talk to the generals and urge them towards compromise, he says. Nevertheless, some investors may be reconsidering their ties to Myanmar. In Singapore, investors are beginning to reevaluate their investment in Myanmar's economy. Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Vivian Balakrishnan, said in a statement, Japan, another country with growing economic ties to Myanmar, is also a major aid donor. Japan might be one of the few actors that has the economic incentives, the leverage on all sides, and the willingness to try to do something about the situation, says a researcher in Thailand with extensive experience in Myanmar who requested anonymity for security reasons. For example, Tokyo's special envoy in Myanmar, Yohei Sasakawa, chairman of the Nippon Foundation, recently helped negotiate a ceasefire between the military and insurgents in the western state of Rakhine, even as political tension built up after pro-democracy parties swept the November election. This level of trust with Myanmar's generals, including with coup leader General Min Aung Hlaing, offers a potential opening for Mr. Sasakawa and other Japanese envoys to urge the military to restore civilian rule, the researcher says. Analysts say Japan prefers mediation over punitive economic measures that could isolate Myanmar and push it towards China. A Chinese sphere of influence? For its part, Beijing's sway in Myanmar is perhaps greater than that of any country, but the historic mistrust of China among Myanmar's military leaders and the public, as well as China's doctrine of non-interference, make it unlikely that China will play a proactive role that goes beyond securing its strategic economic interest in Myanmar. Beijing is in a somewhat awkward position as the result of the coup, says Derek Mitchell, president of the National Democratic Institute and former U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, in a recent podcast. Above all, China seeks to maintain what it considers a privileged position and sphere of influence in Myanmar, while blunting the involvement of the United States and other Western countries, Ambassador Mitchell says. Experts stress that a key source of leverage over Myanmar's coup leaders are the financial interests of top generals who have profited from the country's opening. The leverage anyone has is around parochial issues of money and physical security, says the Southeast Asia expert. No one should lose sight of that. Towards the end of the United States, Britain, Canada, and the European Union have imposed new sanctions on Myanmar's military leaders. U.S. officials last month blocked a move by Myanmar's military rulers to move about $1 billion held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and put a freeze on funds, Reuters reported Thursday. Ultimately, however, the biggest obstacle to military rule is popular support for democratic rule that has flourished over a decade of opening. Protesters in Myanmar have learned from similar pro-democracy movements in Thailand and Hong Kong and have built ties with fellow activists, the Milk Tea Alliance, to help sustain their effort. Targeted sanctions against Myanmar's military chiefs can impose a little cost, but most of these guys have spent their entire lives as internal pariahs. These are not cosmopolitan leaders, says Mr. Pauling. Any influence that the international community, whether it is the U.S. or Japan or Singapore, has is really going to be on the margins. If the protests in the street get 99% of the way there, the U.S. and Europeans and Japanese can help push it the last 1%. Well, let's just move on from that. Pope and top Shiite cleric in Iraq deliver message of coexistence by Nicole Winfield and Qassam Abdul-Zahra. In the plains of Iraq, Pope Francis walked through a narrow alley in Iraq's holy city of Najaf for a historic meeting with the country's top Shiite cleric Saturday, and together they delivered a powerful message of peace, peaceful coexistence in a country still reeling from back-to-back conflicts over the past decade. In a gesture both simple and profound, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani welcomed Pope Francis into his Spartan home. The cleric, one of the most eminent among Shiites worldwide, afterwards said Christians should live in peace in Iraq and enjoy the same rights as other Iraqis. The Vatican said Pope Francis thanked Grand Ayatollah Sistani for having raised his voice in defense of the weakest and most persecuted during some of the most violent times in Iraq's history. Later in the day, the Pope attended a gathering of Iraqi religious leaders in the deserts near a symbol of the country's ancient past, the 6,000-year-old ziggurat in the plains of Ur, also the traditional birthplace of Abraham, the biblical patriarch revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The joint appearance by figures from across Iraq's sectarian spectrum was almost unheard of, given their communities' often bitter divisions. Together, the day's events gave symbolic and practical punch to the central message of Pope Francis's visit, calling for Iraq to embrace its diversity. It is a message he hopes can preserve the place of the thinning Christian population in the tapestry. At a Mass, the Pope celebrated later in Baghdad. Emotional worshippers sang hymns, ululated, and shouted, "Viva la Papa!" or "Long live the Pope!" A rare public moment of joy among a population weighed down by turmoil, economic woes, and the coronavirus pandemic. Still, his message faces a tough sell in a country where every community has been traumatized by sectarian bloodshed and discrimination, where politicians have tied their power to sectarian interests. In Ayatollah Sistani, Pope Francis sought the help of an ascetic, respected figure who is immersed in those sectarian identities, but is also a powerful voice standing above them. Ayatollah Sistani is one of the most senior clerics in Shiite Islam, deeply revered among Shiites in Iraq and worldwide. His rare but powerful political interventions have helped shape present-day Iraq. Their meeting in Ayatollah Sistani's humble home, the first ever between a pope and a grand ayatollah, was months in the making, with every detail painstakingly negotiated beforehand. Early Saturday, traveling in a bulletproof Mercedes-Benz, pulled up along Najaf's narrow and column-lined Rasul Street, which culminates at the Golden Dome Imam Ali Shrine, one of the most revered sites in Shiite Islam. He then walked the few meters down an alley to Ayatollah Sistani's home. A religious official in Najaf called the meeting very positive. He spoke on condition of anonymity because he was not authorized to brief media. The official said Ayatollah Sistani, who normally remains seated for visitors, stood to greet Pope Francis at the door of his room. The Pope removed his shoes before entering Ayatollah Sistani's room and was served tea and a plastic bottle of water. At one point in their 40-minute meeting, the Pope gingerly cradled the Ayatollah's two hands in his own as Ayatollah Sistani leaned in, speaking, according to footage aired on Lebanon's LBC. They sat close to one another without masks. Ayatollah Sistani spoke for most of the meeting, the official said. In a statement issued by his office afterwards, Ayatollah Sistani affirmed that Christians should live like all Iraqis in security and peace and with full constitutional rights. He pointed out the role that the religious authority plays in protecting them and others who have also suffered injustices and harms in the event of past years. Ayatollah Sistani wished Pope Francis and the followers of the Catholic Church happiness and thanked him for taking the trouble to visit him in Najaf, the statement said. Iraqi cheered the meeting, and the Prime Minister responded to it by declaring March 6th a national day of tolerance and coexistence in Iraq. We welcome the Pope's visit to Iraq, and especially to the holy city of Najaf, and his meeting with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, says Najaf resident Haidar al-Yawa. It is a historic visit and hope it will be good for Iraq and the Iraqi people. Iraq's Christian battered by violence and discrimination hope a show of solidarity from Ayatollah Sistani will help secure their place in Iraq and ease intimidation from Shiite militiamen against their community. Ayatollah Sistani's voice is a powerful one, often for moderation, but his word is not law. After 2003, he repeatedly preached calm and restraint as the Shiite majority came under attack by Sunni extremists. Yet brutal Shiite reprisals against Sunni civilians fed a year-long cycle of sectarian violence. His 2014 fatwa, or religious edict, calling on able-bodied men to join the security forces in fighting the Islamic State group, helped ensure the extremists' defeat. But it also swelled the ranks of Shiite militias, many closely tied to Iran and now blamed for discrimination against Sunnis and Christians. Later, Pope Francis evoked the common reverence for Abraham to speak against religious violence at the interfaith gathering at the plains of Ur, near the southern city of Nasiriyah. From this place where faith was born, from the land of our father Abraham, let us affirm that God is merciful, and that the greatest blasphemy is to profane his name by hating our brothers and sisters, Pope Francis said. Hostility, extremism, and violence are not born of a religious heart, they are betrayals of religion. Such interfaith forums are a staple of Pope Francis's international trips, but its sectarian breadth was startling in Iraq. From Shiite and Sunni Muslims to Christians, Yazidis and Zoroastrians, and tiny, ancient, and esoteric faiths like Kaki, a sect among ethnic Kurds, Mandaeans, and Sabian Mandaeans. The Vatican said Iraqi Jews were invited to the event but did not attend, without providing further details. Iraq's ancient Jewish community was decimated in the 20th century by violence and mass emigration fueled by the Arab-Israeli conflict, and only a handful remain. Ali Thiji, a Nasiriyah resident who attended the event, said he hoped the Pope's visit would encourage investment in the area to attract pilgrims and tourists. This is what we were waiting for, he said. This is a message to the government and politicians. They should take care of this city and pay attention to our history. Pope Francis's visit, his first international trip since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, included celebrating Mass in Baghdad later on Saturday. Love is our strength, the source of strength for those of our brothers and sisters who here too have suffered prejudice, indignities, mistreatment, and persecutions for the name of Jesus, Pope Francis told the faithful. Abdul Zahra reported from Baghdad, Associate Press journalist Anwar Khalili in Najaf, Iraq, and Sama Kabul in Baghdad also contributed to this article. Let's move on to Points of Progress by Lindsay McGinnis. United States. A Denver program that dispatches healthcare workers instead of police to respond to low-level nonviolence incidences has completed its first 6 months. The Support Team Assistance Response Program, or STAR, sent a mental health professional and a paramedic to 748 incidents, including trespassing and welfare checks, none of which resulted in police intervention or arrests. Operators flagged more than 2,500 calls as eligible for the alternative response, representing close to 3% of 911 calls, according to STAR's recent progress report. The program offers a more compassionate approach to policing, advocates say, keeping nonviolent offenders, who are often in need of social services, out of the criminal justice system. Denver Chief of Police Paul Pazin says it also frees up officers to focus on serious crimes. Coordinators plan to expand the program by adding more social workers and vans equipped with food and blankets and introducing weekend shifts. In Zimbabwe, a dried fruit processing center in Gokwe, Zimbabwe, is bringing financial stability to more than 3,400 farmers and helping reduce food waste. In what was once a popular cotton growing area, farmers have had to embrace fast-growing cash crops, such as mangoes, to contend with inflation and increasingly erratic weather. Established in November 2020 by the German aid organization, Welthunger Hilfe, Gokwe's processing plant is designed to help farmers deal with surplus mango supply. While gluts are common at the end of each season, the plant has been especially useful during the pandemic, as heavy rains and lockdowns have led to an abundant mango crop and few buyers. The plant is run as a social enterprise with support from the United Nations Trade and Development Agency and the European Union. Over the next few years, General Manager Vernon Mushariwa aims to set up more community-based processing centers throughout Zimbabwe. In Europe, with its first astronaut recruitment drive in more than a decade, the European Space Agency is aiming to bring more women and people with disabilities into outer space. The agency says diversity is one of the main goals of its latest recruitment effort, which will accept applications for about 18 months. Only 2 women have been to space on behalf of ESA, and no space agency has ever opened up applications to people with disabilities, agency officials said. Under the organization's new initiative, the Para Astronaut Feasibility Project, the ESA has committed to invest in defining the necessary adaptations of space hardware in an effort to enable these otherwise excellent qualified professionals to serve as crew members on a safe and useful space mission. In Saudi Arabia, Saudi women can now serve in the military, marking the latest extension of workforce rights. The government announced plans to open the armed forces to women in 2019, but only recently has the online portal accepted female applicants. Women can serve as soldiers, corporals, and sergeants in various branches of the Conservative Kingdom's military. In addition to typical weight and height qualifications, there are extra requirements for female applicants. Women entering the armed services must have a minimum high school education and must not be married to a foreigner. Operating System Specialist Hala al-Nabawi told Arab News that although women in the military has been a controversial topic for decades, she is happy to see more fields opening up to women. In my personal opinion, it is very important for women to be in the military, where they can have an active role in our conservative society. Well, my dear friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for March the 8th, 2021. My name is Pam, and please stay safe until we meet here again.